Hello, students. Today we're going to be talking about colonialism and yoga and the Yoga Sutras. So, what is colonialism? Well, colonialism is when one group of people takes power over another group of people, asserting their will and often their legal system, their culture, and their language. And then they say, oh, your country, well, it's a colonial outpost now. Notably, the British colonized India starting arguably in 1600. So we're going to look at kind of the complicated history of colonialism in India, and we're going to ask what are the implications of that for the study of yoga. So let's get started, and here we go. All right, so the Yoga Sutras, yoga, and colonialism. That's our topic for today. Where are we right now? I mean, we've mostly been looking at the study of the Yoga Sutras by South Asian people, and mostly by Hindus, though we have looked at a bunch of different ways in which the Yoga Sutras have been taken up by modern yoga practitioners, by practitioners of modern postural yoga. So remember when we were looking at White and he had that big chart that just constantly had all of the different translations of the phrase yoga chitta vritti nirodha. What is yoga? Yoga is nirodha, the cessation of the vrittas, the turnings of the chitta, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. And we saw that was translated in all sorts of different ways by contemporary modern Western people. So today we're going to talk about colonialism. Like I said before, colonialism is the process by which one people dominates another by declaring their lands to be an outpost of an empire, hence the British Empire. Colonialists imposed language, culture, and legal structures that are non-indigenous to a culture upon that culture. So in India, you have English. You also have the notion of bureaucracy. And I swear, the people of South Asia figured out a way to even out-bureaucrat the bureaucrats. But surely the notion of contemporary South Asian bureaucracy is a holdover from the British. And of course, the English language that in its own way unifies India. Because if you speak English, you can get around pretty easily in North India and in South India. But if you only speak Hindi or you only speak Tamil, then if you go to the north or the south, respectively, nobody's going to be able to understand you. So in a way, English becomes a type of lingua franca for contemporary India and South Asia. So one of the things I wanted to note is there's a lot of talk and like think pieces about decolonizing. So, I know my partner is very involved in education, and amongst sort of native indigenous people in the United States, people are always talking about decolonizing education or decolonizing knowledge. But the big problem with this, and if you study a lot about colonialism, you see it can't happen. Once a culture is colonized, then the mechanisms of the Western world, such as ideas about rationality, ideas about very much a lot of Christian underpinnings to things, the understanding of the scientific method. So once this is imposed on a people, there really is no going back. I mean, you can try to find and excavate and implement more sort of indigenous forms of knowledge or methods, but you can't decolonize. You can't. Once you've been colonized, even after you kick people out, even after the British get kicked out of India, India is then called post-colonial. It's a post-colonial nation. Now, theoretically, the United States is post-colonial as well, but it's a little bit different. We don't need to get into that completely. So, like I said, there's a lot of talk today about colonialism these days in the press and in opinion pieces, in these sexy think pieces that we're all constantly reading. But the study of post-colonial cultures and post-colonial literature, which is really a study of colonialism and its effects, is a robust and critical field, especially if you're in English or comparative lit. But it really is everywhere. I'm going to give you a taste of post-colonial theory today. And I want to tell you, starting right off the bat, that when I first went to India, I had no idea about this colonial project and the effects of colonialism. I think I knew to some degree that the British left India in 47, Gandhi was important or something, but I hadn't really thought about the deep scars of British rule, the way that Indian culture was changed by their encounter with the British. Now, when I go to India, I see it everywhere. I see colonialism and the scars of colonialism everywhere I look. I mean, I was even thinking that, when I first went to India in 99, I had all these British friends, right, that I met over there. And they were all just deeply guilty about their ancestors and their countries role in India. And we'll talk about some of the unfortunate effects of colonialism in a minute. You might have noticed outcries about the British colonial project upon the death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. She began her rule in 1952, which was after 1947 when the British had quit India, but it was before a lot of the other colonial projects had dissolved completely. So the British had a lot of other colonies, especially in Africa. Now, all the major European cultures had colonial projects, but arguably the British were the most wide-ranging and effective. I mean, look at this map. These are all the British colonies, and all those dots are all the islands they took. Look how much of Africa there is. Look at Australia. Look at, all of South Asia. Look at Canada, which still considers itself a colony in some ways of Great Britain. And then now look at that tiny little orange speck. That's Britain. Look at all their colonies. So this was a big change in the world. Now, I can almost hear Indians saying, sure, the British brought the English language, which does unify India, and they set up the trains, and the Indian train system is one of the most amazing train systems in the world. And it's a huge employer. And the British arguably set that out. And they did set it up to be a transportation zone for all of India. As opposed to if you go to Vietnam and see the trains that the French put in, it goes right from the diamond mine to the ports. That's it. So the British did create the very interesting railroad system that is amazing. But the cost was immense to India and to Indians. And the fallout from that British colonial status, it really does continue today. So the stakes are big here. I mean, when Westerners are incorporating or consuming South Asian religion and culture, such as when they say Hatha Yoga is Indian and it is their right to have it, I mean, that's when you if a Western yoga practitioner looks and says, the eternal truth of the Yoga Sutra is there for me and you, they're really saying, it's there for me. So you have to think about, what does it mean that we have so many Westerners practicing a thing that is supposedly Indian, but we'll see it's not as Indian as a lot of people say in the third part of the class. So colonialism has big stakes. And what is also at stakes is when a lot of South Asians and scholars like me look at people who are, claiming to be yogis to this day, when they're, kind of just doing their white boy, white girl exercise program, there's a problem. It's uncomfortable. When Westerners pick up yoga and declare that it is Indian and that they belong to a yoga tradition, you can ask a whole bunch of questions. One of the ways to think about this is a Foucauldian notion from the thinker Michel Foucault called power and knowledge. Knowledge is always connected to power. Power is always connected to knowledge. What does it mean that we have all these white Westerners suddenly being like, this is what the Yoga Sutras mean? In some cases, they're doing linguistic analysis and whatnot, and that's kind of fine. But it's when people proclaim to give you the truth of any religion or culture that things get uncomfortable. Maybe it's uncomfortable for me. I mean, really, who am I? I've lived in India quite a bit. I'm not Indian. Who am I to say? Well, who am I to say? I'm a guy who learned Sanskrit and got a PhD and spent all this time doing research grants. But there are people that say that only an Indian should be speaking for Hinduism, to which I would say, I'm not speaking for Hinduism. I'm a social critic. I'm not a caretaker of any religion. I'm telling you about intriguing histories. I am telling you about cultural histories. I'm talking to you about the East and the West. I am not a proponent of any truth of any religion or culture. That said, I do think South Asian cultures are pretty darn cool. Okay, so what about the Yoga Sutras? The Yoga Sutras, I like to think of in the reading from White, have been interpreted by 3 different groups, and we're going to come back to 2 of these later. So first you have European scholars, philosophers, and philologists. So think about all those German guys that we read about today and all the British guys. And they were all guys. We don't start really seeing a large amount of women doing sort of scholarship on this until I'd say the last 50 years. But in my last 10 years of being a scholar, specifically in the last 10 years, not when I first started in the early 2000s, there are a lot more women that are being represented. It used to really be an all-boys club, especially among those learning Sanskrit. Okay, so the scholars are mostly philosophers. And when we look at like Hegel and we look at the Schlegels, and I can't believe that there are Schlegel brothers that got into a fight with Hegel. And every time I say it out loud, I sound silly. So there are scholars who are philosophers, and some of them only have a reading knowledge of Sanskrit. Mostly they're cribbing off earlier translations by other scholars. If you actually read any of the commentaries in Sanskrit, they'll just look at the translations into English and kind of work from there. So in many ways, they're kind of similar to a lot of the people writing books on the Yoga Sutras now that don't read Sanskrit and just kind of interpret the sutras from the other English translations. So the Britishers who were writing in English or Latin were often colonial officers. That means they worked to actively rule and economically discriminate India and Indians. They were working for the three different groups of British folks that ruled India, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the philosophers here, mostly these Germans, were writing to create sort of systematic philosophies that understand everything. And many of these sort of especially German romantics thought, oh, the glories of all culture must come from the oldest culture, which is South Asia. So I have a romantic notion of all truth coming from this font of wisdom that is from South Asia. And of course, why would it be so great? Oh, because it's Indo-European. Oh, it's just us all along. That's us. A friend of mine who's a yoga scholar actually jokes that Max Mueller started studying this incredible culture of India and thought, well, obviously it's awesome. It's just us. It's just all us back there. Okay. So the search for a systematic philosophy rooted in a romantic ideal that is East and is a font of knowledge is a characteristically German project. But can you see how when people say, oh, the real truth comes from Asia, they're kind of consuming it. Unless you're going to Asia and learning the truth, whatever that means. I mean, if you're just taking someone else's philosophy and saying that's the absolute truth and that it lines up with what you already argued, that's very much consuming someone else's culture. So these scholars were really writing to one another. They weren't writing to an Indian audience or to any practicing religious audience. They were not writing to yoga practitioners, like a community of yoga practitioners, like the Western folks that put out books, and even the Indian books that put out, and even Indians that put out books on the practice of yoga today. Now, at this time that we're talking about, there were a few Indians in the conversation, and we'll talk about this more in the next module. In particular, there was an author named Rajendra Lal, and we'll all, there, look, I got a slide for you, but I didn't use it. So we have a guy named Rajendra Lal Mitras, which White writes about pretty extensively. Now, he's an interesting character. So he was an Indian who was writing to contribute to the Indological Project. The Indological Project is the study of Sanskrit texts to understand the great treasure of Sanskrit literature. Now, he was the first Indologist, one who was a specialist in India. In fact, I am an Indologist. He was the first Indologist who was of Indian origin himself. What is Indology? But it is the study of the Sanskrit treasury of texts, all of the glorious Sanskrit sources. This guy was also the head of the library at the Asiatic Society of India, which is still around, and it's a pretty amazing place. His groundbreaking yoga study is obscure and nearly unavailable today, but White summarizes it. And in many ways, it's a lot clearer than Patanjali or Vyasa. So maybe after White's work has come out, there will be more study of his work. I should hope so. I keep meaning to ask Professor White if he's in talks about getting Rajendra Lal Mitra's book reprinted. So there are actually more of these folks than we realize, and more is being discovered about Indian authors and religious figures who incorporate Western ideas and combine them with Indian ideas to create hybrid contexts that are quite significant and quite sophisticated. One is a character named Sabapati Swami, and a close friend of mine is publishing a book very soon on the topic of him. He was an Indian yogi who practiced a form of sort of very intense meditation forms. He read a lot of Western occultism and Western New Thought, whatnot, and incorporated them into his own philosophy to create something new, which is an Indian philosophy influenced by Western thought, but still authentically Indian. And I think we're going to find more and more of these characters, especially as we dig back through the archives. So the other group are the occultists. Specifically here, I'm talking about theosophists, and I'll talk about them extensively in the next module, but here's just a quick overview. So occult is a word that we generally know as meaning bad, but occult really just means hidden or occluded. So it is a secret. So what is the thing about the occult? It's secret knowledge, secret techniques. So there is an occult group called Theosophy that got started amongst the British, but has great presence in India. And I used to live near one of their lodges in California. So Theosophy argues that there is a connection and experience of God achieved through spiritual ecstasy, direct intuition, or special individual relations. And in this wacky picture over here, you can see there is no religion higher than truth. It's almost a forceful combination of as many religions as possible in order to find truth. And these theosophists, we're going to see later, had a big presence in India and were even involved in the independence movement. And their founder, Madame Blavatsky, very important person, was absolutely a shyster. So we will talk about her soon enough. So what they have this idea of, these theosophists, is that they can collect all of the secret teachings sort of around the world, and those will reveal the hidden teachings of the masters who have come through the ages. Yes, they argue that there is a circle of masters, disembodied, often with vaguely Tibetan or Indian names, that you can go into trances with, and they will reveal the perennial wisdom of the ages. Madame Blavatsky supposedly was able to channel with these masters, though notably she did not know the Tibetan language nor the Hindi language. And also, we found that a lot of these so-called revealed things that she had were all written in her own handwriting. We'll talk about her fraudulent status later. Okay, so the teachings and practices of these hidden masters that come through all of the religious teachings of the world allow a newfound manner by which human consciousness can be expanded. Through the expanding of the individual consciousnesses of all of the people doing theosophy, they will expand human culture and human consciousness as a whole, leading to a dawn of a new age, a new Atlantis, if you will. So I don't know if they managed to succeed on that. An intriguing thing is they're an outgrowth of spiritualism. And remember this, anytime you're in a religious studies class, spiritualism is not spirituality. Spiritualism is doing seances. And a seance means to sit down, literally just in French. So what was spiritualism? Spiritualism was when mediums would interact with the dead. They also would document ectoplasm, so the materialization of spiritual energy in this world that was often temporary, though there have been some people that have claimed to be able to capture it in wax. So yes, this is the contact between human and non-human disembodied entities, whether those disembodied entities be ghosts or be the enlightened Himalayan masters that speak through Madame Blavatsky. So the theosophists were writing to other theosophists and other occultists. Now we'll see in time that they ended up spending a lot of time in India and having a lot of contact with other Indians. They tried to actually have a young Indian man become their new leader and announcing him to be the new coming Messiah, reincarnation of Christ. And when he got to be of age, he was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That his name was Jiddu Krishnamurti, and I've stayed at his ashram a couple of times. He died in the 80s. But yeah, I kind of like his books. They're a little kooky, but they're all right. Anyway, that's enough of that. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up is all these writers we're going to be talking about today and tomorrow are writing between the 1700s and into the early 20th century. So because of that, we have to grapple with the problem of colonialism. All these folks were shaped by colonialism. So look here at this picture. This is the British Empire in South Asia. If you look at a picture of South Asia today, you'll see that, well, one, you'll see in this picture, they didn't take Nepal. Nepal was never colonized. But if you look at this map, you'll see Thailand, Burma, Bhutan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, chunks of Afghanistan. All that. The British ruled over all of that at certain various points. Okay, so we're moving away from speculative pre-modern India, to look at modern India. we're looking at the world of these people. Didn't I have a thing with dates on it? Yeah. Okay, so one thing I wanted to make a point here is, let me quick go through this with you. So the British founded the East India Company in the year 1600, the first multinational corporation that was out there for profit, operating in various nations. In 1757, the EIC, the East India Company, gained rule over India. Effectively, after a big battle, they declared themselves to have control over the full geography of India. In 1858, in 1857, there was another rebellion. And in 1858, the Raj was formed. What is the Raj? Which just means the kingship. That was when the East India Company was liquidated and was taken under control by the British monarchy, the British state. This becomes the Raj. And so for nearly 100 years, this is when that India was really properly under the rule of Britain completely. In 1947, you see independence occurred for various reasons that I'll talk about, but you also see partition, where India was divided up from one nation that was a colony, into Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. So it went from one country to three, and splitting those countries apart caused irrevocable damage that we still have to deal with the pains of it today. All right. So what's that first period I'm talking about? In the 1600s, the British East India Company, or as I call it, the EIC, a lot of people use that abbreviation, it was founded. This is the first multinational corporation, and it sent its officers with its new company charter to do this to India. Their goal was to make profits. That's it. And there wasn't a lot of training for these guys. They learned everything on the ground. If you have basic education, knew some accounting, you'd go over to India, you'd learn the local languages, you'd figure out whatever industry you were working on, and it was your goal to just make as much money as possible. Their goal was to make profits. They would set up businesses and hire a wide range of local contractors, and their goal would be to maximize profits and send those profits back to England. And also, after serving for 20 odd years, they would go back, usually poor men leave, and come back wealthy, having extracted quite a bit of money from their various business endeavors down there. They also oversaw a project of plunder. If you go to any British museum, you will be surprised at how much South Indian art and jewelry can just be found everywhere. It's unfortunate. It's plunder is what it is. So, like I said before, India was not the only British colonial project. We saw that they were all over the place. They had colonies all over. But it's an understatement to note that this East India Company destabilized India by aggravating tensions, specifically tensions between Muslims and Hindus. Now, Muslims and Hindus, the Mughals had ruled for quite some time. By the time 1600s come around, the East India Company is there. And Hindus and Muslims didn't get along great, but they didn't get along as poorly as they do now, or when the British were there. The British had an idea of divide and conquer. If they could exploit Indians, making Hindus and Muslims not get along, or one linguistic group not get along with another linguistic group, or even a racial group not get along with another racial group, they would, because they found that India was significantly easier to control when Indians were fighting one another. So they disrupted networks of power and sovereignty, because before the British came, there was a system of Maharajas who ruled regional kingdoms. So you'd have a Maharaja of Nawab, you'd have a Maharaja of Mysore. So there are hundreds of Maharajas and small kingdoms, and they interacted with one another because there was no, great nation of India. There was no umbrella of India at the time. What it was is there was just a wide range of regional kingdoms. There were a few empires in the history of India, but they really fade out probably around 500 CE. You see the last of the Guptas. And then, so from 500 to 1600, you have different Maharajas, but you also have the Mughals. So the Mughals were Muslim rulers traditionally from Persia and from Afghanistan. Some say Mongol. In fact, because they were from Central Asia originally, they would have been Mongols that do become called Mughals. That's where our word Mughal comes from in the United States and US English. So the Mughals had a pretty wide, sophisticated system, but they didn't rule everybody. And they kind of worked with the different Maharajas. They took over some of their stuff. They let other Maharajas go. But there was no unified system of rule. The only unified system of rule we've seen in India is when the British get really going. Okay, so the British weren't capable of dividing India completely or of getting rid of all of the Maharajas, but they did a pretty good job. And by the time of independence in 1947, the Maharaja system had been decimated. And India may have gained self-rule at 1947, but the indigenous system of regional kingdoms was absolutely gone. So we need to also have some little bit of knowledge here about 19th and 20th century occultists and their little goofy little esoteric worlds. So these occultist esotericists saw that yoga and Indic cultures were fonts of all wisdom. And if they were the fonts of true wisdom, then they belonged to the world. And if they belonged to the world, they obviously belonged to Westerners who were predominantly white. In this ideology, the wisdom and cultures of the world effectively are all open to consumption by Westerners, either for profit, or to sell yoga clothes, or to gain the truth and gain spiritual evolution. And some might say, spiritual evolution is higher than all things. And then you say, yeah, but what if your consumption of spiritual evolution has some pretty negative consequences? So when we talk about spirituality or like the truth of yoga being open to all people, be aware that there is an ideology of colonialism there, but also absolutely of consumerism. You're very much consuming the wisdom of the world. And there's also a very Protestant notion there. It's like, well, there is the truth of Protestant Christianity. So Catholicism is the same. And so we're going to have missions and we're going to convert all the savages to be good Christians because that is the truth. And screw their culture. They need to all become Christians because otherwise they're all going to hell. So that there are these difficult issues when we talk about power, knowledge. So today, we kind of can look at the this European background in India that builds up to the rebirth of the Yoga Sutras in the 19th and 20th century. These are the philosophical interpretations. These are the underpinnings from which we see modern postural yoga, and we see this New Age yoga in the West. So two of our most important, I'll look at those later. Okay, so two. This is the second phase. So from 1857 to 1858, there was a loose consortium of, hold on, let me step back for a split second. 1600, a loose consortium of British capitalists was founded in 1600. They consolidated and declared their power after winning a war in Bengal in 1757. This was the famous Battle of Plassey in East India, which established the East India Company ruling India. Before that, from 1600 to 1757, they were just a company trying to establish power all over the place. But after 1757, they are the rulers of India. They established themselves up. Before that, they were just like kind of corporate pirates. 1757 marks the beginning of proper British rule. And the start of British Empire, really, because at that point, the East India Company was somewhat associated with the British state, but not completely. But it's the beginning of what we will see coming later. So the East India Company sort of functioned as a sort of proxy for the British Empire, but they didn't effectively take control of India until 1858. Now, official colonial era starts in 1858. Well, why 1858? There was a rebellion against British rule. This is very complicated. And the EIC was working as a proxy for the Brits. And in 1958, the Government of India Act liquidated the EIC and incorporated it into the British government. So this government rule was called the British Raj. With the coming of the Raj, the colonial officers and military men no longer intermingled and married with Indians. And earlier times, such as this prior to eras, sometimes, these British characters would stay in country so long they wouldn't want to come home. They would intermarry with Indian women. They would start wearing Indian clothing. They would only speak in Hindustani. A couple of them were approached to, I remember reading about this one time, they were approached to give their life stories as colonial officers, and they're like, yeah, but only if I can tell you in Hindi, because I've forgotten my English, because I just use Hindi all the time. There's one scholar named William Dalrymple who writes about these characters and calls them white Mughals because they effectively were, Westerners that were ruling almost like the Mughal British rulers before. So the British Raj, however, sees a different type of colonial and military officers. These characters from 1858 to 1947 very much kept themselves separate from India. They were a high society. They would bring their own families with them, and they would not interact with Indians except for as servants. So they saw themselves as different than their Indian subjects. So the Raj made arguments that India could not rule itself due to conflicts over religion. However, these British policies and censuses and arguments they were constantly making aggravated India's conflicts over religions. Now, Muslims and Hindus didn't always get along, but they didn't see themselves as diametrically opposed in the way that they did under this era of the British rule. So the thing you got to remember is that the British Raj was out for itself. In one case, in 1943, they created a wheat famine in Bengal in eastern India, shipping the wheat needed to feed people in India back to Britain during World War II. And an estimated 2 to 3 million people died. That's a lot. There were only 60 million Bengalis at the time. And we look, and they did this in Bengal a couple of times. I mean, we see other instances of, I can't remember the dates right off my head, but there were a couple other famines that the British just, they built it. They just took everything out. And when people didn't have enough to eat, they just starved. So that's the ugliness of the colonial empire. Yes. So like I said, well, I didn't really tell you this, but there were a couple of, it wasn't just the British that were in India. And it was not just the British that were in India. The Portuguese were in the West. They had a colonial outpost in what is now Goa, and they have excellent food there. So the Portuguese were there. And in the Dutch in South India had somewhat of a colonial operation that wasn't very strong. There's some really gorgeous old Dutch cemeteries out there that I've been to. So that would be in the South. Also in the South, in Tamil Nadu, is a place called Pondicherry. And that was where the French had a colonial project. And the French government is still operating there today. And they actually run a number of really interesting schools for the study of Indian culture. Okay, colonial rule. It ended in partition in 1947. So plenty of Indians, including Mahatma Gandhi, were agitating for self-rule, doing campaigns of nonviolence. Others campaigned for violence. The nonviolent kind of faction rolled out, and India and the Congress Party were able to establish their own state. However, when the British left, they charmingly decided that India could not rule itself because there's too much conflict over religion. So they cracked India up. So they cut off into West Pakistan, and they cut off into East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. So when they created Pakistan, they divided the Punjab in half. And when they did that, everybody went, all the Hindus went one way and all the Muslims went the other. And when they met, they fought and lots of people died. 14 million people were displaced. They moved. Probably the largest human migration in history of large groups of people. And there were anywhere from 600,000 to 2 million deaths. And it divided the country. So the majority, like about half the Muslims in India said, I'm not going to Pakistan, I'm Indian. And the other half said, I'm getting out of here because we'll never get treated right in Pakistan. And Pakistan has always been significantly poorer, had a lot more difficulties over there, not as stable and whatnot. But what's intriguing to me is it's not like all the Muslims left. Half of them stayed and said, no, this is my place. I ain't going anywhere. Then some Hindus and Sikhs did stay back in Pakistan, not a lot. And that story goes on to this day. So remember when you hear about Pakistan and Indian fighting, the British did that. I mean, there's a lot of arguments about it. But one guy, Lord Mountbatten, just looked at a map and was like, let's just split it right there. That'll be good. I mean, it's like dividing East Texas from West Texas and assuming it wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so I want to talk for a few more minutes about a few things. The first thing I want to talk about is legal codes and colonial rule. Because what we know about Sanskrit literature and the first Westerners to learn Sanskrit were colonial officers. So in seeking to set up a rule of law, the British tried to think about what rules of law, what systems of law already exist in India. Well, you have Sharia law and the attendant, like the Mughal law, all of the Islamic legal codes in Persia and whatnot. So those are pretty well established. And There were lots of people that knew Persian at that point, lots of Britishers that knew Persian. And Islamic law is really straightforward to Westerners. I mean, it had analogs. It was in Persian. It had been practiced for centuries in Mughal India. And Persian was a known language for the British. They've been studying it for a long time. Hindu law is a little different. It was diffuse. There is no single Hindu law code, except maybe after what the British did. There's tons and tons of scriptures on Hindu law, but I mean, they're kind of all over the place. I know when I look at them, I sometimes look at some really old texts, but I'm always using commentaries that are much later. They're like from the 1400s. So Hindu legal law required consulting pundits and shastras, people who knew these shastra. Shastra means a book. So the other problem was, and I think White makes this nice link, he makes this statement nicely, is they were in Sanskrit, which is one of the most bedevilingly complicated languages, one of the hardest languages you can learn. So who's going to learn it? Well, William Jones did. William Jones was a scholar of Persian and later a scholar of Sanskrit, and he was a jurist in Bengal. So he was a judge and a lawyer. And he proposed that if the British were going to rule India, they had to write a unified Hindu legal code. Now, he's talking with pundits and translating texts and whatever, and he's like, I think these guys are making stuff up. I think they're making up their own legal rulings and then just like giving me Sanskrit sources whenever they think it's right. So I don't trust them. So you can see right there from the get, this British guy who's trying to figure out a Hindu legal law doesn't, go and find, Hindu pundits and say, all right, explain all this to me. He's like, I don't trust you guys. And you'll see with the British, they regularly do this. They will have a disdain or distrust for Indian and Indian authorities. So Jones began to study, and Jones began to really study all the Sanskrit, and he proposed a new style of study that he called Indology, the study of India, or Orientalism. Now, this word Orientalism we hear a lot about because there's a guy named Edward Said who wrote famously that there are different knowledge projects in different cultures. He was writing about the Middle East in particular, and he argued that when Westerners who are Orientalists write about the East, by which there he means the Middle East, they argue that the Middle East is, and these cultures are static and unchangeling. They essentialize essential differences between the cultures. Okay, so what does it mean? The West is rational. The East is irrational. The West is masculine. The East is feminine. The West is scientific. The East is mystical. So it makes a very vague, like essentialist claim on Eastern religions. So when people really simplify the religions of India or the Middle East, they're often operating out of Orientalism. They don't let the people that they're looking be at least as complicated as they are. So as long as you see the East as degenerate and, degenerate, feminine, emasculine, and like artistic and whatnot, it's kind of like right brain, left brain. As long as you can think of them that way, they're easy to grasp. They're easy to study. They're easy to dominate. The West was considered developed, rational, changing, and superior to the East. So it was the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling, a colonial officer and great novelist, wrote, to take the savages of the East and give them Western rationality, to civilize them, because the East is inherently weak, degenerate, sensual, non-rigorous, and fanciful. So that's the way these guys thought about India. But remember, these guys are colonial officers. Their whole thing is, I got to dominate these people and make a lot of money. All right, so another guy we're going to look at is Henry Thomas Colebrook. So he was also a company officer, and he studied Sanskrit with Jones, but then Jones sent him off into a different area of the country, and which is an area near Benares, which is known for its great wisdom and long venerated city of learning, sort of like the Paris of India. So what he did was he learned Sanskrit very well, and he created an incredible collection of Sanskrit manuscripts, handwritten texts, that are the basis of the catalogs in the in India off East India. What is that? The India Company? Doesn't matter. He brought forth the manuscripts from India and put them in the British museums, and people are still studying them to this day. He brought out tons and tons of texts. So one of the interesting things is after he returned from India, he authored a study of Sankhya and yoga in 1828. This is the first description of the Yoga Sutras in English, and he likes them fine, but he doesn't like yoga. He cuts yoga out of all the darshanas. So he does a study of the 6 darshanas, and he only has 5. He says, no yoga, we don't need yoga. He cuts yoga from Sankhya, arguing that yoga is but a variant form of Sankhya philosophy. Thereby, he renders these darshanas down to 5. He was really disparaging of yoga. He connected the practices of yogis, remember the practice between yogis and yoga, and said that they don't have any traditional connections to the Yoga Sutras. So notably, he's arguing that the yogas that these yogis are doing are not real yoga. But the yoga that he's describing them doing, that these yogis are doing, is actually tantric or hatha yoga, which we'll get into those distinctions a little bit more as we go. So following Colebrook, other scholars continue this separation for yoga and philosophy to separate yoga from the activities of yogis. That was a terrible sentence. Think of it this way. If you get a philosophical system where you can just look at Sankhya and maybe the Yoga Sutras and say, oh, this is this nice, rational, meditative thing, and it's different from this wacky stuff that yogis do because they didn't like yogis, then we can say that this is the real yoga, and then the yoga that the yogis are doing is not real yoga, even though the yoga that the yogis were doing, we actually have texts and traditions and whatnot. We don't have a lot from the Yoga Sutras. After the 1600, you really don't see any discussion of the Yoga Sutras in India. So one of an interesting problem with this is it's funny to judge the yogis against the Yoga Sutras because they weren't interested in the Yoga Sutras. The yogis were interested in their own traditions. They may have been illiterate themselves, or they were interested in their own texts of yoga that we'll look at when we get to medieval yoga. All right, so what did the British think about the yogis? Well, you got some interesting problems here that I think White brings out pretty well on this. The yogis in our minds, when we think of yogis, think about yogis before you had me talking about all these, warrior shakedown artists and criminals and vampires. Yogis are thought of as being like forest-dwelling gurus, living in hermitages in the forest. They're living in balance with nature, spending all their days and nights in meditation. Or maybe they're peaceful yoga instructors that are found on every street corner in Santa Fe strip mall. So sages are described as these like peaceful figures living in the forest in the Sanskrit literature. But yogis are not. Even in indigenous sources and in the British sources, yogis are described as kind of tough guys. So White makes this distinction between sages and yogis. Sages would be sort of these gurus that live in the forest. They're mythical creatures. If you read a text like the Ramayana, Rama, the great king, is displaced and he has to run off and live in the forest for years and years and years. And he's constantly coming into contact with these munis, Muni from Mauni, these silent, grand rishi type figures that we saw last week. So White writes, I think, beautifully on page 66, and I'm going to read to you for a second this paragraph. How interesting then that not a single 19th century account by either Europeans or Indians or by the yogis themselves portray them as peaceful ascetics practicing meditation pache the Yoga Sutra. Instead, the overwhelming majority of accounts from the 16th century onward depict yogis as either beggars or ragtag mercenary fighters. On the first count, a multitude of eyewitness reports speak of the marauding bands of yogis behaving like shakedown artists, mobbing entrances to temples, pilgrimage sites, and marketplaces, staging freak shows, the mango trick, and the infamous bed of nails. The bed of nails comes from an idea. Or simply creating a ruckus until harassed merchants would pay them off to simply go away or hector someone else. On the second, they were viewed in much the same way as the modern-day Taliban in Afghanistan, as part religious fanatic and part terrorist, fighting gangs of warriors known to poison their enemies or cut their throats and drink their warm blood. Yogis, kind of scary dudes. To some degree, they're right. Some of the yogis would act, a lot of yogis would act like this. Maybe even the majority of yogis. They weren't acting like peaceful sages just out in the wilderness. So medieval and later texts and later yoga texts that describe yogis are generally actually rooted in Tantra, and they describe a Tantra yoga. So what is Tantra yoga? A Tantra yogi was one who was initiated into an order, and was practicing such powers as taking over other people's bodies and cavorting sexually with female yoginis. Remember, the yoginis are witches? They're the animal-headed goddesses that will swoop down, and if you're a yogi and you're powerful and you're brave, you can dally with them erotically. If not, they eat you and you die. So it's tricky. So Tantra yogis. And we see that these yogis that we're talking about, these Tantra yogis more, they have sort of siddhis, and magic siddhis means perfections, and magic powers that are called vibhutis. And in fact, chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the Yoga Sutras is all about these vibhutis, these yoga powers. But the thing is, Tantras don't claim any connections to the Yoga Sutras, and the Hatha Yoga texts at the time that we're talking about later in the medieval and post-medieval, they don't even talk about the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras just aren't that big of a deal. These are yogis doing Hatha Yoga, and that Hatha Yoga that's a couple of positions that you hold for a long period of time. And what are they claiming to do? They're claiming to codify energies, to force the fluid structure that moves from your head all the way down your spine, and from ejaculate, you lose everything. These yogis were transmuting that and forcing all of their bodily fluids up in their body to create immortality and magical powers. These Hatha texts don't claim connection to the Yoga Sutras, neither do the Tantra texts. And also Tantra texts, and also the Yoga Sutras don't use the term Hatha Yoga, and they don't use the term Tantra. So what's going on? I mean, if yoga is what yogis do, and what yogis do is in contrast to the aims of British rule, then these law and order officers would not want to encourage it. Remember this, in the history of India and in attempts to rule India, groups of Indian yogis would align with indigenous powers and against colonialism. Before the British time, yogi armies and yogi strongmen would regularly work as mercenaries or become gurus to kings and lend out their disciples to fight on behalf of the king. And often, as White describes, once they were in power and in bed with the king effectively, then they would manipulate the king to support their monasteries. Yogi mercenaries were especially common between the 15th century and the 18th century. Ta-da! 1600s to 1900s. During this period, you have these yogi armies around, and the yogi armies would align with the Maharajas against the British. There is never a case of any of these yogi armies ever aligning with the British. They were always against the British. They would go and definitely go with like a Muslim king and work with him against the British or somebody else, but they would never side with the British. So why do the British want to crack down on yogis? Why do they call them 420 yogis, illegal yogis or fake yogis? Why? Because these yogis were trying to get in the way of them making the big bucks. And remember, that's what these guys were always up to. The Britishers were there to make money. Don't give them any of that nonsense about taming the savage and all that nonsense. They were there to make and extract money. But what about these yogis, these power brokers? They had no interest in the Yoga Sutras. So you get this weird point. So Colebrook actually writes a translation of the Yoga Sutras, and he says, the Yoga Sutras aren't quite what yogis do, but that's obvious because the yogis were already saying, yeah, we're not interested in those Yoga Sutras. They never heard of it. There were Brahmins in Benares who were somewhat in the midst of a Sanskrit renaissance. They were writing all sorts of texts on philosophy, but they weren't writing on the Yoga Sutras. They weren't really even writing on yoga. In reality, nobody was studying the yoga of the Yoga Sutras. They were doing Tantra yoga and Hatha yoga, and there was lots of Sanskrit stuff being written on different philosophies. And these are yogas that they're actually doing that are characterized by breath control, moving subtle energies, using body positions to reverse the hydraulic flow of the body, seeking to gain immortality and magical powers. So there was a brief renaissance of people studying the Yoga Sutras at some point, like the 1700s in South India. And that's where Vijnana Bhakshu comes out of, and his sort of qualified non-dualism commentary on the Yoga Sutras. But it wasn't that important of a text. There weren't, we'll read about a whole bunch of like yoga practitioners like Swami Saraswati Dayananda. Well, he wasn't a yoga practitioner. He wanted to learn yoga, and he looked for yoga for 9 years, and he couldn't find anybody that would teach it to him because likely they didn't know it. And if they did, it was going to be Hatha yoga or Tantra yoga. Nobody was talking about the Yoga Sutras at that point. Okay, so the point of the matter is, during this period, nobody cared about the Yoga Sutras. But these British guys start writing about the Yoga Sutras again. Why? Interesting question. So here's my final point. So White actually says he spent the better part of a summer in, I think, 2010 or 2011. I remember when he was doing this. He does a quantitative study of manuscripts and manuscript catalogs. So what the British actually did throughout India, and this is actually great, is they would go to different libraries of Maharajas and whatnot, and they would write down the titles of texts, the colophons. A colophon tells you what a text is about, a date if possible. Then they would measure it and sometimes give you an overview of their contents. And they would put out these, what they call hand lists, which would be a book like this thick that just describes every single manuscript in there. So White went and looked at a lot of them. And I've done similar works on this on some of the tantras I work at. And he looked to see what Yoga Sutra material was out there. So White does a quantitative study of manuscripts and manuscripts catalogs, and he discovers that after the 16th century, the Yoga Sutra manuscripts weren't being copied, for nobody was commissioning copies of the manuscripts. Nobody was studying the Yoga Sutras. Now, what do I mean by commissioning copies? So here's the thing. We didn't have, books in India. So what you had stuff on palm leaf, birch leaf, early papers and whatnot. And because of the climate in India, any paper manuscript or any manuscript you get is going to basically disintegrate in 100 or 200 years. So what wealthy patrons and kings would do is they would sponsor professional writers to rewrite and recopy the manuscripts, and that would preserve the manuscript over time. Because we have some very old palm leaf manuscripts, but not as old as you would really like. Palm leaf tends to last a lot longer than anything else. Paper stuff doesn't last at all. And they weren't going to write on vellum. You know what vellum is? Vellum is a type of early paper that, like the American Constitution is written on, that is made from byproducts of animals. It's made from like goat skin and whatnot like that. Vellum. And it lasts forever. It lasts a really long time. Okay, so White is looking at all these catalogs, and he says, he is only looking at manuscript catalogs found in India, Europe, and North America. And in India, there's still a lot of manuscript libraries, and I've been in a bunch that have not been cataloged. So we're doing the best with what we can here. Now, White is looking at the manuscript catalogs that are titled Yoga, Nyaya Vaisheshika, or Vedanta. He's not looking at the epic stuff or whatever, or medical materials. So White decides to look at about 20,000 texts. Now, among that 20,000 manuscripts, I got an extra zero on there. Among those 20,000 manuscripts, he concludes that across India, the manuscript repositories only have 1.27% of known manuscripts are on the Yoga Sutras. All right, so boom. 1.27% of all the manuscripts are Yoga Sutras. When you're looking at texts solely on yoga, only 33% are about Yoga Sutras. The rest are about Hatha and Tantra Yoga. Amongst all manuscripts that he looked at, these 20,000 manuscripts, 44% were Nyaya Vaisheshika, so those are logic and atomism. And finally, 50% of all of these manuscripts were about Vedanta Yoga, which was really the predominant philosophical thing at the time. Nobody was really looking at yoga and Sankhya at the time. They were done. So what were people really studying and reproducing during this British era? The pundits were studying Nyaya Vaisheshika and Vedanta. So what's the implication here? In other words, there are very few manuscripts on Yoga Sutras. If this were to include all the literary and non-philosophical Sanskrit sources, then the numbers would probably be even lower as far as percentages go. So remember, he's looking at Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Vedanta, those types of manuscripts. And only 1.27 of all of that are Yoga Sutras. So what is this to say? Once again, the Yoga Sutras that we're going to see coming up in the 20th century becoming a really big deal, we're not that big of a deal. So next time, we're going to talk about the rediscovery of the Yoga Sutras by the Britishers and the Germans. We'll talk about yoga and Western philosophy. And we're going to talk about yoga, occultism, and the Theosophical Society. So I'll catch you on the flippy side. Take care.